She was only a servant, scrubbing floors and tending fires in a world that barely saw her as human, until a Sioux scout returned one night from 3 years of tracking outlaws across the Dakota Territory and heard her humming an ancient Lakota lullaby to the half-breed daughter he'd abandoned, a melody she had no earthly reason to know. The wind carried more than dust across the Nebraska plains that October evening in 1876. It carried the scent of approaching winter and the weight of 3 years' worth of guilt riding alongside Gray Eagle as he guided his paint horse down the familiar ridge overlooking Fort Mitchell. The outpost looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile against the endless grassland that stretched toward the Black Hills, like a sea of gold and amber in the dying light. But the chimney smoke rising from the commander's quarters told him that life had continued in his absence, that people had moved forward while he remained frozen in the moment he'd walked away. Gray Eagle had been born Michael Standing Bear to a Lakota mother and a cavalry father who'd never acknowledged his existence, raised between two worlds that each claimed half his soul but neither fully accepted him as their own. And it was this belonging nowhere that had made him perfect for the work that took him away, tracking renegades and horse thieves across territories where his mixed blood let him pass as white to settlers and Indian to tribes, a ghost moving between worlds. But tonight, he wasn't a scout or a tracker, or the man who'd earned respect from both cavalry officers and Sioux war chiefs for his ability to read sign and bring back outlaws alive. Tonight, he was just a father returning to face the daughter he'd left behind when grief had made him too dangerous to be near anything innocent. 3 years ago, his wife Morning Star had died bringing their daughter into the world, bleeding out in their small cabin while the fort's doctor was away treating. Soldiers and the midwife arrived too late to do anything but wrap the baby in blankets and hand her to a man who saw only his dead wife's face in the child's features. He'd named the baby Little Star in honor of her mother, had tried for 6 months to be what she needed. But every time he looked at her, he saw Morning Star's eyes, heard her laugh in the baby's cries, felt the weight of promises he'd made to protect her and failed to keep, until the grief became so heavy he could barely breathe in the same room as his own child. So he'd done what he'd learned to do when the pain became unbearable. He'd run, leaving Little Star with the fort's housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, and riding out on a tracking assignment that was supposed to last 6 weeks but had stretched into 3 years of following cold trails and avoiding the one place that mattered. The letters from Mrs. Patterson had found him in saloons and army camps across the territory, each one carefully worded to avoid judgment, but heavy with information about a little girl who asked where her papa had gone and when he was coming home. Letters he'd read once and then burned because keeping them felt like keeping wounds open. But the last letter had been different, urgent in a way that cut through his carefully constructed distance like a blade through leather. She won't speak anymore. Gray Eagle hasn't said a word in 2 months. Just stares out the window toward the ridge where you disappeared. And I'm getting too old to manage a 3-year-old who's forgotten how to be a child. You need to come home before it's too late. Those words had followed him for 300 miles, echoing in his mind with every hoofbeat as he'd finally turned his horse east toward the one place he'd sworn never to return to. And now, as the fort's lights flickered to life in the gathering dusk, he wondered if coming back would heal what he'd broken or just break it more completely. The guard at the gate recognized him, despite the 3 years and the new lines around his eyes, waving him through with a nod that carried no judgment, just the weary acceptance of men who'd learned that life rarely unfolded the way anyone planned. Gray Eagle left his horse at the stable with instructions to rub him down and grain him well, then walked across the parade ground toward the commander's quarters where Mrs. Patterson had taken Little Star after his wife died, his boots crunching on frost-brittle grass as he tried to prepare himself for whatever he might find. The windows glowed warm against the cold night, and he could see shadows moving inside, the comfortable bustle of evening routines. families settling in for supper and storytelling, the kind of domestic peace he'd once imagined having with Morning Star and their children in a cabin of their own. He paused outside the door, hand raised to knock. When he heard it, a voice soft and clear, drifting through the wooden walls like smoke, carrying a melody that stopped his heart mid-beat. It was a Lakota lullaby, one his own mother had sung to him when he was small, before the cavalry came and scattered their band to the reservations. A song about the spirit world watching over children while they slept, and ancestors singing them safely through the night. But the voice wasn't Lakota, wasn't even Indian. It was young and white and female, with the careful pronunciation of someone who'd learned the words phonetically without understanding their deeper meaning, yet somehow managing to capture the song's essence in a way that raised the hair on his arms. Grey Eagle pressed closer to the door, his breath forming clouds in the cold air as he strained to hear more, wondering who in this isolated fort could possibly know a song his own people had nearly forgotten, and why they would be singing it to sleep now. "Little star," the voice whispered in English, tender as morning light, "your grandmother's spirit watches over you, and the eagles carry your dreams to the sky where your mama waits." The words were spoken with such genuine love that Grey Eagle felt something crack inside his chest. A wall he'd built around his heart 3 years ago, suddenly showing fissures, because someone was speaking to his daughter the way Morning Star would have, with the kind of devotion he'd been too broken to provide. He eased the door open just enough to peer inside, and what he saw made his knees nearly buckle. A young woman sat in the rocking chair by the fire, her golden hair catching the light as she held a small child against her shoulder. And Grey Eagle recognized his daughter immediately, despite the 3 years that had transformed her from baby to little girl. The same dark eyes as her mother, the same stubborn chin, the same way of curling her small fist in whoever was holding her. But it was the woman holding her that took his breath away. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23. With skin like porcelain and eyes the color of summer sky, wearing a simple grey dress that marked her as household help rather than family, yet cradling little Star with the fierce protectiveness of a mother. She was humming now, the same Lakota melody, her voice weaving through the verses with surprising skill, and little Star, his daughter who supposedly hadn't spoken in months, was humming along in a sweet, high voice that pierced Grey Eagle's heart like an arrow. The scene was so perfect, so peaceful, that he almost turned around and left again, because walking into that room would shatter whatever magic had finally brought his daughter back to life. And he wasn't sure he had the right to destroy something so beautiful just because he'd finally found the courage to come home. But little Star chose that moment to look up, and her dark eyes met his through the crack in the door. And Grey Eagle watched his daughter's face transform with recognition and something that might have been joy or might have been fear. "Papa," she whispered, the word carrying 3 years of waiting, and the young woman's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock as she took in the man standing in the doorway like a ghost from a story she'd been told but never quite believed. Grey Eagle pushed the door fully open and stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and the young woman rose slowly from the rocking chair, still holding little Star, but positioning herself protectively between the child and this stranger, who might be her father, but looked wild and dangerous after 3 years in the wilderness. "You're Grey Eagle," she said, and it wasn't a question but a statement delivered with the kind of quiet strength that comes from facing hard truths every day. "Mrs. Patterson said you might come back," he nodded, not trusting his voice, studying the way little Star clung to this woman while watching him with eyes that held too much understanding for a 3-year-old. As if she'd learned early that people left and sometimes didn't come back. "What's your name?" he managed to ask, his voice rougher than he'd intended from 3 years of talking mostly to horses and the wind. "Rose Catherine Webb," she said, lifting her chin in a gesture that reminded him of Morning Star when she was being particularly stubborn. "But little star calls me Rose. How long have you been here?" he asked, and something in his tone made her eyes flash with what might have been defiance. 2 years, she said simply. "Mrs. Patterson needed help with little star after she started walking, and I needed work after my family passed." Grey Eagle studied her face, looking for signs of the kind of desperation that drove people to take jobs in isolated forts where the pay was poor and the danger was constant. But all he saw was genuine affection when she looked down at his daughter. "She knows Lakota songs," he said, and it came out more like an accusation than he'd meant it to. Rose's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't look away. "Mrs. Patterson said her mother used to sing to her, and I thought she might remember if she heard them again. So I asked around until I found someone who could teach me the words." The simple honesty of it hit him harder than any elaborate explanation could have, because this young woman had cared enough about his daughter's heritage to seek out songs in a language she didn't speak, to learn melodies that connected little star to the mother she'd lost, and the culture her mixed blood made complicated. "Who taught you?" he asked, genuinely curious now despite himself. "Old Joseph from the trading post," she said. "He said his grandmother was Lakota, that she used to sing those songs to him when he was small. He was happy to share them with someone who wanted to keep them alive." Grey Eagle felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the knot he'd carried in his chest for 3 years. Because this stranger had done more to honor Morningstar's memory than he had since the day she died. Little Star had been watching this exchange with the solemn attention children give to adult conversations that might affect their world. But now she reached one small hand toward Grey Eagle, and he found himself stepping closer despite every instinct telling him to run. "Sing, Papa," Little Star said, her voice clear and sure. "Rose sing, now Papa sing." The request was so simple, so innocent, that Grey Eagle felt his carefully constructed walls crumble completely. Because his daughter wasn't asking him to explain where he'd been or why he'd left. She was just asking him to be part of the music that had brought her comfort. Rose was watching him with those summer sky eyes, and he could see her taking his measure, trying to decide if this dangerous-looking man with his weather-beaten face and trail-worn clothes was someone who could be trusted with the heart of a little girl who'd already lost too much. Grey Eagle cleared his throat and began to sing, his voice rusty from disuse, but growing stronger as the words came back to him, the Lakota flowing from his tongue like water returning to a dry riverbed. And Little Star's face lit up with a joy so pure it nearly broke him. "Situm." Rose joined in on the chorus, her pronunciation careful but heartfelt. And for a moment, the three of them stood there connected by something older and deeper than words. Something that spoke to the part of Little Star that belonged to both worlds and needed both to be complete. When the song ended, Little Star clapped her small hands together and laughed, the sound bright as silver bells, and Grey Eagle realized he was crying not the bitter tears he'd shed in saloons across the territory, but something cleaner, like rain after a long drought. "She's been waiting for you," Rose said softly, and there was no judgment in her voice. Just the kind of understanding that comes from carrying your own load of grief. Every night she asked the stars to bring her papa home. Grey Eagle looked at his daughter, really looked at her, seeing not just Morningstar's ghost but Little Star herself, a brave, beautiful child who'd survived abandonment and loss and somehow still had the capacity for joy, thanks in large part to the young woman who'd made herself into the mother she needed. "I don't know how to be her father," he admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep and painful. "I don't know how to look at her without seeing her mother," Rose finished gently. "Mrs. Patterson told me. But Grey Eagle, she's not just her mother's daughter. She's yours too, and she needs you to see that." The use of his name, spoken with such quiet authority by this slip of a girl who couldn't weigh more than 100 pounds soaking wet, startled him into really looking at her. And he realized that Rose Catherine Webb was not just a servant who'd stumbled into caring for his child. She was someone who'd chosen to pour her heart into healing a broken family, and somehow, in the process, had become essential to their survival. Little Star reached for him again, and this time Grey Eagle didn't hesitate. Lifting his daughter into his arms and feeling the weight of her trust settle around his shoulders like a sacred burden, while Rose watched with eyes that held secrets of their own and a smile that suggested she understood more about second chances than most people learned in a lifetime. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them all that winter was coming. But inside, the small room warmed by firelight and filled with voices that had found their harmony again. It felt like the first day of spring. The morning sun painted the fort's wooden walls gold. But inside the commander's quarters, shadows still clung to the corners like secrets refusing to reveal themselves. And Grey Eagle found himself studying Rose Catherine Webb as she moved through her morning routine with Little Star, wondering what other mysteries lay hidden behind those summer blue eyes. He'd slept poorly on the narrow cot Mrs. Patterson had arranged for him in the storage room, his mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. And now, as he watched Rose braid his daughter's dark hair with practiced fingers, he realized how little he actually knew about the woman who'd become the center of Little Star's world. "Tell me about your family," he said without preamble, his voice cutting through the comfortable domesticity like a blade. And Rose's hands stilled for just a moment before continuing their work on Little Star's hair. "There's not much to tell," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "They died of fever 2 winters ago, and I came west looking for work. But Grey Eagle had spent too many years reading sign and tracking lies to miss the tension that crept into her shoulders. The way her eyes didn't quite meet his when she spoke of her past. And he filed that information away like a hunter noting broken twigs on a trail. Little Star squirmed in Rose's lap, eager to be free and explore, now that her father had returned. But Rose held her gently while finishing the intricate braids that would keep the child's hair neat throughout the day, her fingers working with the kind of skill that spoke of long practice. "Where did you learn to braid hair like that?" Grey Eagle asked, genuinely curious, because the pattern Rose was weaving was distinctly Native American. The kind of style Lakota mothers taught their daughters, not something a white woman would know without specific instruction. Rose's cheeks flushed pink, and she focused intently on her work rather than looking at him. "Mrs. Patterson showed me. She said it was how Little Star's mother used to wear her hair." The answer was plausible, but something in Rose's voice suggested there was more to the story, and Grey Eagle found himself wondering if this young woman held secrets that went deeper than her mysterious knowledge of Lakota songs. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and Colonel Marcus Whitfield stepped into the room without waiting for permission. His blue uniform crisp despite the early hour, his grey mustache perfectly waxed, his pale eyes taking in the scene with the kind of calculating assessment that made Grey Eagle's hand drift instinctively toward his knife. "Standing Bear," the colonel said, using Grey Eagle's white name with deliberate emphasis. "I heard you'd returned. We need to talk." Grey Eagle stood slowly, his 6-foot frame unfolding with the dangerous grace of a predator, and he saw Rose gather Little Star closer, her protective instincts flaring at the sudden tension in the room. "Colonel," Grey Eagle replied, his tone neutral, but his dark eyes watchful. "I'm no longer under military command. Haven't been since I finished my last tracking assignment." Whitfield's smile was thin as winter ice. "Perhaps, but you're still a half-breed who abandoned his child for 3 years. And now you want to waltz back in and reclaim her like she's a horse you left at the stable." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and Grey Eagle felt his muscles tense for violence. But Rose's voice cut through the moment before blood could be spilled. "Colonel Whitfield," she said, her tone respectful but firm. "Little Star needs her father. She's been asking for him every day since I've known her. Whitfield's pale eyes shifted to Rose, and Grey Eagle didn't like the way the older man's gaze lingered on her face. Her neck, the curve of her waist beneath her simple dress. "Miss Webb," the colonel said, his voice taking on a different quality, smoother and more predatory. "I've been meaning to speak with you as well. Perhaps we should discuss your future here at the fort. Now that circumstances are changing." Rose's grip on Little Star tightened, and Grey Eagle caught the flash of fear that crossed her face before she could hide it. A reaction that told him more about her relationship with the colonel than any words could have. "My future is with Little Star," Rose said quietly, but Grey Eagle heard the steel beneath the silk. The kind of quiet determination that had helped her survive whatever had brought her to this isolated outpost. Whitfield stepped closer, and Grey Eagle moved without thinking, placing himself between the colonel and Rose, his hand now resting openly on the handle of his knife. "The lady said no, Colonel," Grey Eagle said, his voice soft but deadly. "Where I come from, a man listens when a lady speaks." The two men faced each other across the small room, predators testing each other's resolve, while Rose watched with Little Star pressed against her shoulder, and the child seemed to sense the danger because she began to whimper softly. "This isn't over, Standing Bear," Whitfield said finally, backing toward the door. "You can't just disappear for 3 years and expect everything to be the same when you return. There are consequences for abandoning your responsibilities." After the colonel left, the room felt smaller, charged with unspoken threats and half-revealed truths, and Grey Eagle found himself looking at Rose with new eyes, understanding that whatever had brought her to Fort Mitchell, she was running from something. "He bothers you," Grey Eagle said, and it wasn't a question. Rose set Little Star down to play with her cornhusk doll, then busied herself straightening bedding that was already perfectly neat, her movements sharp with suppressed emotion. "Colonel Whitfield believes that unmarried women at isolated posts exist for his convenience," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "He's been very clear about his expectations." Grey Eagle felt a cold rage settle in his chest, the kind of fury that had made him dangerous during his scouting days. "Has he touched you?" "Not yet," Rose replied, and the words carried the weight of inevitability, as if she'd accepted that it was only a matter of time. "But he's made it clear that my position here depends on my cooperation." The admission hit Grey Eagle like a physical blow, because he realized that Rose, Catherine Webb, hadn't just been caring for his daughter out of kindness. She'd been trapped in a situation where refusing to help could have meant losing her only source of protection from a predator in uniform. Little Star looked up from her doll, sensing the adult tension, and reached for Rose's hand with the innocent trust of a child who didn't yet understand that the world could be cruel to those who had no power to defend themselves. "Mama, Rose, sad?" Little Star asked, and the use of Mama sent a jolt through Grey Eagle's heart, because his daughter had found a way to name the love she'd received without diminishing the memory of the mother she'd lost. Rose knelt beside Little Star, smoothing her dark hair with gentle fingers. "No, sweetheart. Mama Rose is just thinking about grown-up things that don't matter when we have each other." But Grey Eagle saw the tears Rose was fighting to hide, the way her hands trembled slightly as she touched his daughter's face. And he understood that this young woman had been carrying burdens far heavier than a 3-year-old's daily care. "Tell me about your family," he said again, but this time his voice was gentler, an invitation rather than an interrogation. "The real story, not the one you tell to keep people from asking questions." Rose was quiet for so long that Grey Eagle thought she wouldn't answer. But finally she began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father was a missionary," she said, staring at her hands. "We lived on a reservation in Minnesota, trying to bring Christianity to the Dakota people, trying to convince them to give up their old ways and embrace civilization." Grey Eagle felt his chest tighten because he knew how that story usually ended. Had seen too many reservations where good intentions paved the road to cultural destruction. "I learned Dakota songs from the women who worked in our mission," Rose continued. They taught me their language, their stories, their ways of caring for children, even though my father would have forbidden it if he'd known. The revelation explained so much. Rose's knowledge of native songs, her instinctive understanding of how to care for a mixed-blood child, her ability to see Little Star as whole rather than divided between two worlds. What happened to them? Grey Eagle asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Rose's voice broke slightly. The Dakota War of 1862. My father believed he could negotiate peace, that his friendship with the tribal leaders would protect us. She didn't need to finish the story. Grey Eagle had heard variations of it too many times. Well-meaning white families caught in the crossfire of a war that had been brewing for decades, victims of tensions they'd helped create without meaning to. I was visiting my aunt in St. Paul when it happened, Rose whispered. I came back to find everything burned, everyone dead, and the soldiers said it was my fault for living among savages. The word hit Grey Eagle like a slap, not because Rose had used it, but because she'd repeated it with the wounded acceptance of someone who'd been told too many times that caring about native people made her complicit in their supposed savagery. So you came west, he said, understanding now why she'd ended up in this isolated place, why she'd been willing to take work that kept her far from civilization and the judgments that came with it. I couldn't stay in Minnesota, Rose said, her voice growing stronger. Everyone looked at me like I was contaminated, like I'd chosen the wrong side, but I didn't see sides. I just saw people who'd been kind to me. Little Star had been playing quietly during this conversation, but now she crawled over to Rose and climbed into her lap, sensing that Mama Rose needed comfort, even if she didn't understand why. The women at the mission, Grey Eagle said carefully, they taught you more than songs, didn't they? Rose nodded, wrapping her arms around Little Star. They taught me how to read the signs when someone was sick, which plants could heal and which could harm, how to deliver babies safely, how to prepare bodies for burial with proper respect. The admission explained the subtle confidence Rose had shown in caring for Little Star, the way she seemed to know instinctively what the child needed, the healing songs she hummed that went deeper than simple lullabies. That's why Whitfield wants you to stay, Grey Eagle realized. You're not just a servant. You're the closest thing this fort has to a doctor. Rose's laugh was bitter. A woman who learned medicine from Indians isn't a doctor, Grey Eagle. She's a witch. And Whitfield knows I can't go anywhere else without him providing references. The trap was elegant in its cruelty. Rose's skills made her valuable, but her background made her unemployable anywhere else, leaving her dependent on a man who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity. Grey Eagle studied Rose's face, seeing past the young woman's careful composure to the steel beneath. The kind of strength that had helped her survive the destruction of everything she'd known and still find the capacity to love a half-breed child that wasn't even her own. What if you didn't need his references? Grey Eagle asked quietly. Rose looked up at him, hope and fear warring in her summer blue eyes. What do you mean? Grey Eagle said, his voice gaining strength as the idea took shape. What if you had a different kind of protection, a different reason to stay that had nothing to do with Colonel Whitfield's games? Little Star yawned against Rose's shoulder, her small body growing heavy with the approach of her afternoon nap. And Rose automatically began to rock her gently, the motion as natural as breathing. She loves you, Grey Eagle said, watching his daughter settle into sleep. More than that, she trusts you completely. And trust isn't something Little Star gives easily. Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away this time. I love her too, she admitted, more than I ever thought possible. She's become the center of my world, the honesty in her voice, the fierce protectiveness she showed his daughter, the way she'd learned Lakota songs and Dakota healing arts not for herself, but to better serve the people she cared about. All of it combined to show Grey Eagle a woman worth fighting for. Then we have something to build on, he said, and Rose Catherine Webb looked at him with eyes that held the first real hope she'd allowed herself in 2 years. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising the kind of winter tempest that could trap people together for days. But inside the warm room, where a Sioux scout had found his daughter in the arms of a woman who understood what it meant to lose everything and still choose love, the future suddenly looked less like an ending and more like a beginning. The fever came with the first blizzard of winter, striking down half the fort's children like an invisible enemy, more deadly than any war party. And Rose Catherine Webb found herself thrust into a battle that would either prove her worth to the entire community or destroy what little safety she'd managed to build. It started with Tommy Morrison, the blacksmith's youngest son. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Who collapsed during evening chores with skin burning hot and eyes that rolled back white, his small body convulsing in ways that sent his mother into hysterics and his father racing for the fort's doctor. But Dr. Henley was 3 days' ride away, treating cavalry wounded at Fort Robinson. And by the time the sun set on that first day, 2 more children had fallen ill with the same symptoms, their desperate families gathering in the mess hall to pray and panic in equal measure. Grey Eagle watched from the shadows as Rose moved between the sick children with quiet authority, her hands cool and steady as she checked pulses and temperatures, her voice calm as she instructed mothers how to brew willow bark tea and keep fevered bodies from burning themselves out. "She learned from the heathens," whispered Mrs. Henderson, the sutler's wife, her voice carrying the kind of venom that could poison minds faster than any disease. "Probably cursed these children with Indian magic." The accusation rippled through the gathered families like wildfire, feeding on fear and desperation until Grey Eagle saw doubt creeping into eyes that had looked at Rose with gratitude just moments before. But Rose didn't flinch from the whispers or the suspicious stares. She simply continued her work, mixing herbs that filled the air with strange but pleasant scents, teaching mothers how to position their children so they could breathe easier, her hands never stopping even when her own exhaustion threatened to buckle her knees. Little Star had been mercifully spared so far, but Grey Eagle kept her close, watching for any sign of fever while his heart hammered with the kind of terror that came from having already lost one person he couldn't bear to lose. "Papa scared?" Little Star asked, her dark eyes too knowing for a 3-year-old. And Grey Eagle realized his fear was written across his face, in lines his daughter could read, even if she couldn't fully understand them. "A little," he admitted, because lying to children about danger never protected them the way adults hoped it would. "But Mama Rose knows how to help sick children feel better," Little Star nodded solemnly, then padded across the room to where Rose was tending to the Morrison boy, her small hand slipping into Rose's free one with the kind of trust that could move mountains. "Mama Rose tired," Little Star announced, and Rose looked down at the child with eyes that held more love than exhaustion. "Little Star, help." The simple offer broke something loose in Rose's careful composure, and Grey Eagle saw tears slip down her cheeks as she lifted Little Star onto her lap, holding her close while still keeping one hand on Tommy Morrison's burning forehead. "You help by being brave and staying healthy," Rose whispered against Little Star's dark hair. "That's the biggest help Mama Rose could ask for." But Tommy Morrison's fever spiked that night, and his convulsions grew so violent that his mother began keening like a woman already in mourning, the sound cutting through the fort's walls like a blade through cloth. Rose worked through the darkness, her hands moving with desperate precision as she applied cool cloths and forced bitter medicine between the boy's clenched teeth. But Grey Eagle could see the fear in her movements, the terrible knowledge that all her skills might not be enough. "He's dying," Mrs. Morrison sobbed, clutching at Rose's skirts. "My baby's dying, and that army doctor ain't here, and you're just a servant girl playing at being something you're not." The words hit Rose like physical blows, but she didn't stop working, didn't defend herself, didn't waste energy on anything that wouldn't help save the child burning up in her arms. Then Little Star did something that changed everything. She slipped away from Grey Eagle's watchful eye and crawled up onto the bed where Tommy lay convulsing, her small hands reaching for his burning face with the fearless compassion of innocence. "No," Rose gasped, lunging forward to pull Little Star away from the contagion. But the child was already singing. It was a Dakota healing song, one of the ones Rose had hummed to her during quiet moments. But Little Star sang it with a purity that seemed to fill the room with something older and deeper than medicine. Tommy's convulsions slowed, then stopped, his breathing easing as Little Star's voice rose and fell like wind through prairie grass. And Grey Eagle felt the hair on his arm stand up as he recognized the power in that moment. How does she know that song? Mrs. Morrison whispered, her tear-streaked face turned toward Little Star with something approaching awe. "I taught it to her," Rose said quietly, still holding her breath as Tommy's fever seemed to break, sweat beading on his small forehead as his body finally began to cool. "It's a healing song the Dakota women use when children are very sick." The silence that followed was heavy with implications, because everyone in that room had just witnessed something that couldn't be explained by Christian doctrine or army medical procedures. "Indian magic," someone whispered. But this time the words carried wonder instead of accusation. By morning, Tommy Morrison was sitting up and asking for his mother's cornbread, and word of the miracle had spread through the fort like grass fire, bringing desperate families to Rose's door with children whose fevers hadn't broken. Grey Eagle watched Rose work through the second day without sleep, her face pale with exhaustion, but her hands still steady as she moved from child to child, dispensing medicines that seemed to work better than anything Dr. Henley had ever prescribed. "She's going to collapse," Mrs. Patterson warned. The older woman's face creased with worry as she watched Rose sway on her feet while mixing another batch of fever-breaking tea. But Rose refused to rest while children were still sick. And Grey Eagle realized he was seeing something rare and precious, a woman who would literally pour out her life for people who had spent months treating her as less than human. The crisis came on the third night, when Rose finally did collapse, her body giving out just as the last child's fever broke, and Grey Eagle caught her before she could hit the floor, her skin burning with the same fever she'd been fighting in others. "No," he whispered, gathering her into his arms with a desperation that surprised him, because somewhere in the last 3 days he'd stopped seeing Rose as just Little Star's caregiver and started seeing her as something infinitely more precious. Little Star appeared at his elbow, her dark eyes wide with understanding that went beyond her years. "Papa fix Mama, Rose?" Grey Eagle carried Rose to his bed, laying her gently on the narrow cot while Mrs. Patterson bustled around gathering the same herbs and medicines Rose had used to save the other children. "She's been giving herself the fever medicine," Mrs. Patterson muttered, checking the supplies, keeping herself going on willow bark and pure stubbornness. But her body's finally had enough. For 2 days, Grey Eagle kept vigil beside Rose's bed, cooling her burning skin with damp cloths and forcing medicine between her lips when she was lucid enough to swallow, while Little Star sat nearby, singing the healing songs Rose had taught her. The fort had grown quiet around them, the crisis past but the gratitude remaining, and Grey Eagle was surprised to find visitors at his door, families who'd once whispered about Rose's Indian connections, now bringing soup and fresh bread, their children's healthy faces testimony to her skill. "She saved my Tommy," Mrs. Morrison said, setting a pot of stew beside the bed where Rose lay unconscious. "I said terrible things about her, called her names when I should have been thanking God she was here. Others came too, farmers and soldiers, wives and children, all of them carrying offerings of food or medicine or simply quiet prayers, until Grey Eagle realized that Rose Catherine Webb had transformed from outcast servant to beloved healer in the space of a week. But it was Colonel Whitfield's visit that changed everything. The man entered without knocking, his pale eyes taking in the scene with calculating precision, and Grey Eagle tensed for confrontation, even as he continued bathing Rose's fevered brow. "Soon, Quite the little miracle worker, isn't she? Whitfield said, his voice carrying undertones that made Grey Eagle's hand drift toward his knife. Shame it would be if something were to happen to such a valuable asset. Grey Eagle stood slowly, placing himself between the Colonel and Rose's vulnerable form. Say what you came to say, Whitfield. The Colonel's smile was cold as winter wind. I came to discuss Miss Webb's future. Now that she's proven herself so indispensable to our little community, her future is whatever she chooses it to be, Grey Eagle replied. But Whitfield's laugh was sharp with malice. Is it? Because I've been corresponding with authorities back in Minnesota. Very interesting stories about a missionary's daughter who survived the Dakota uprising by collaborating with the savages who murdered her family. The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Grey Eagle felt his world shift dangerously. Because he understood immediately what weapon Whitfield was wielding. That's a lie, he said. But his voice lacked conviction because he'd seen how quickly communities could turn on anyone associated with Indians. How easily fear could transform heroes into villains. Is it? Whitfield asked, pulling a folded paper from his uniform jacket. Because I have witness statements saying young Rose Webb was seen learning heathen rituals from Dakota women, practicing savage medicine, speaking their language like she was one of them. Grey Eagle stared at the document, understanding that truth and lies could become indistinguishable once they were written down by the right authorities. What do you want? He asked, because men like Whitfield always wanted something. Simple, the Colonel said, his eyes shifting to Rose's unconscious form with a hunger that made Grey Eagle sick. Miss Webb continues her medical work here at the fort, under my direct supervision, and those unfortunate documents disappear. The threat was clear. Submit to his control or face charges that could see Rose hanged as a traitor, and Grey Eagle felt rage building in his chest like a summer storm. But before he could respond, Rose's eyes fluttered open, a fever-bright gaze moving between the two men with understanding that cut through her illness like a blade. I heard, she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. I heard what he said. Whitfield stepped closer to the bed, his smile widening. Then you understand your position, Miss Webb, and the generous offer I'm making. Rose struggled to sit up, Grey Eagle's hands steadying her as she faced her tormentor with courage that took his breath away. I understand that you're a coward who preys on women because real men would put you in the ground, she said, her quiet voice carrying more authority than Whitfield's bluster ever could. The Colonel's face darkened with fury, but before he could respond, the door opened to admit Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Morrison, and a half-dozen other women whose children Rose had saved. Colonel, Mrs. Patterson said, her tone deceptively mild, we came to check on our angel of mercy, and we couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Grey Eagle watched Whitfield's confident expression crumble as he realized he'd been heard by witnesses who would spread word of his threats throughout the fort within hours. Ladies, the Colonel said, attempting to recover his composure, this is a private military matter. Threatening the woman who saved our children seems like a community matter to me, Mrs. Morrison said, stepping forward with the fierce protectiveness of a mother defending her young. And this community has a long memory for men who mistake kindness for weakness. Whitfield looked around the room, seeing his power challenged by a force he'd underestimated, the gratitude of parents whose children might have died without Rose's care. This isn't over, he said, backing toward the door. But his words lacked their earlier conviction. After he left, Rose collapsed back onto the pillow, her brief surge of strength spent, but her eyes held a light that hadn't been there before. Thank you, she whispered to the women who'd come to her defense, and Grey Eagle saw tears of gratitude rather than fear on her cheeks. Mrs. Patterson smoothed Rose's hair with maternal gentleness. You saved our babies, dear. The least we can do is save you from that snake in uniform. As the women filed out, promising to return with more food and medicine, Grey Eagle sat beside Rose's bed and took her hand in his. feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and the tremor that betrayed her lingering fever. "You don't have to face him alone anymore," he said quietly. And Rose's fingers tightened around his with surprising strength. "I know," she whispered, her summer blue eyes holding his with an intensity that made his heart race. "I have you now, don't I?" The question was simple, but its implications were vast, and Grey Eagle found himself nodding before his mind had fully processed what he was agreeing to. Outside, the blizzard was beginning to ease, but inside the small room, where a Sioux scout held the hand of a woman who'd proven herself worthy of any protection he could offer, the real storm was just beginning. The war party struck at dawn on the coldest morning of the year, their painted faces emerging from the white landscape like demons from a frozen hell. And Rose Catherine Webb found herself caught between two worlds that suddenly wanted to destroy each other. Grey Eagle had sensed them coming in his bones, the way animals sense earthquakes before the earth begins to shake, and he'd spent the night walking the fort's perimeter with growing unease, his scout's instincts screaming warnings that no one else could hear. The attack began with arrows flying like deadly snow, striking down the sentries before they could sound the alarm, followed by war cries that echoed off the wooden walls like the screams of ancient spirits seeking vengeance. Rose was tending to Little Star's morning braids when the first arrow punched through the window, embedding itself in the wall inches from where she sat, its eagle feathers still trembling with the force of impact. "Get down!" Grey Eagle shouted, bursting through the door with his rifle in his hands and battle light blazing in his dark eyes. "Lakota war party, at least 30 braves. They've got the fort surrounded." Rose grabbed Little Star and dove beneath the heavy wooden table, her heart hammering as she pressed the child's face against her shoulder to muffle the terrifying sounds of men dying just outside their walls. But Little Star wasn't crying. Instead, she was listening to the war cries with an expression of intense concentration, her young mind processing sounds that spoke to the native blood running through her veins. "Papa," she whispered, her voice carrying an eerie calm that chilled Rose to the bone. "They calling for Ghost Horse." Grey Eagle went rigid at his daughter's words, his face draining of color as he recognized a name that should have been buried with the dead. "That's impossible," he breathed, but Rose could see the terrible knowledge dawning in his eyes. "Ghost Horse died 3 years ago at Wounded Creek." The sound of splintering wood announced that the attackers had breached the fort's main gate, and Grey Eagle moved to the window, his rifle trained on the courtyard where painted warriors were pouring through the gap like water through a broken dam. Rose watched his face change as he studied the attacking force, seeing something that transformed his expression from grim determination to absolute horror. "What is it?" she asked, but Grey Eagle's answer came in a voice she didn't recognize, hollow and broken as if something essential had died inside him. "The war paint," he said, his words barely audible above the chaos outside. "Those are the markings of Ghost Horse's band, the warriors who were supposed to be dead." Before Rose could ask what that meant, a new voice cut through the battle sounds, clear, authoritative, speaking in rapid Lakota that made Grey Eagle's hands shake on his rifle. Little Star lifted her head at the sound, her dark eyes wide with recognition that no 3-year-old should have possessed. "Uncle," she said simply, and Rose felt her world tilt sideways as she understood that this wasn't a random attack. It was a family reunion painted in blood and betrayal. Grey Eagle moved away from the window with the mechanical precision of a man in shock, his face a mask that couldn't quite hide the guilt and grief warring beneath the surface. "Who is Ghost Horse?" Rose demanded, but she already suspected the answer would shatter everything she thought she knew about the man she'd begun to trust. "My brother," Grey Eagle admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep and painful. "My twin brother, who was supposed to die with his wife and child at Wounded Creek 3 years ago." The confession hit Rose like a physical blow, because she understood immediately why Grey Eagle had disappeared for 3 years, why he'd been unable to face his daughter, why guilt had driven him into the wilderness. You led the cavalry to them, she whispered. The pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. You were scouting for the army when they attacked your own people. Grey Eagle's silence was answer enough, and Rose felt something precious and fragile break inside her chest. Because the man she'd begun to love had blood on his hands that could never be washed clean. The fighting outside intensified, and Rose could hear soldiers screaming orders while musket fire cracked like thunder. But inside the small room where terrible truths were being revealed, the silence was deafening. I didn't know, Grey Eagle said finally, his voice raw with 3 years of suppressed anguish. I was tracking horse thieves, following their trail to what I thought was an empty camp. I didn't know Ghost Horse had taken his family there to hide from the reservation agents. Rose clutched Little Star closer, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd learned. Because the man she'd trusted with her heart and her future had inadvertently caused a massacre that included his own family. But he's alive, she said, trying to find some thread of hope in the nightmare they'd stumbled into. If he's here leading this attack, then he survived. Grey Eagle's laugh was bitter as winter wind. He survived to discover that his twin brother had betrayed him to the Blue Coats, that his wife died screaming his name while soldiers burned their lodge, that his infant son was trampled by cavalry horses while trying to crawl to his mother's body. The horror of it crashed over Rose like a physical wave, and she understood now why Ghost Horse had painted his face for war, why he'd spent 3 years planning this moment, why his war cries carried the sound of a man who had nothing left to lose. A tremendous crash shook the building as something heavy struck the door, followed by the sound of wood splintering under the impact of a war axe. "He's coming for me," Grey Eagle said, checking his rifle's ammunition with steady hands, despite the chaos in his eyes. "He's been hunting me for 3 years, and now he's found me." Rose looked at Little Star, who was watching her father with the solemn understanding of a child who'd learned too early that the world was full of pain that adults couldn't protect her from. "What about her?" Rose asked, because whatever crimes Grey Eagle had committed, Little Star was innocent of everything except being born into a family torn apart by war and betrayal. "Ghost Horse loved Morning Star like a sister," Grey Eagle said, his voice softening as he looked at his daughter. "He won't hurt Little Star. She's all that's left of his brother's wife." The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and iron, and Ghost Horse stepped through the wreckage like an avenging spirit, his face painted in the traditional patterns of a warrior seeking justice for the dead. Rose's breath caught as she saw him clearly for the first time, because the resemblance to Grey Eagle was unmistakable. They were identical twins, mirror images of each other, but where Grey Eagle carried guilt like a weight on his shoulders, Ghost Horse burned with the cold fire of righteous fury. "Brother," Ghost Horse said, the word dripping with contempt as he leveled a rifle at Grey Eagle's chest. "You look older. The weight of betrayal ages a man quickly." Grey Eagle made no move to defend himself, his own weapon hanging loose in his hands as he faced the brother he'd thought dead for 3 years. "I didn't know you were there," he said. But Ghost Horse's expression didn't change. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," Ghost Horse replied, his voice carrying the pain of someone who'd lost everything and had nothing left but vengeance. "You chose the white man's gold over your own people's blood." Rose watched the confrontation with growing horror, understanding that she was witnessing the climax of a tragedy that had been building for years. But she couldn't stay silent while the man she loved prepared to die for sins that had tormented him every day since they were committed. "He suffered too," she said, rising from behind the table with Little Star in her arms. "He's carried the guilt of what happened for 3 years. It's destroyed him." Ghost Horse's dark eyes shifted to Rose, taking in her defensive posture, the way she held Little Star, the obvious bond between them. "And who are you to speak for the traitor?" he asked, but his tone held curiosity rather than anger. "I'm the woman who loves his daughter," Rose said, meeting Ghost Horse's gaze with steady courage. And the woman who's seen him wake up screaming your name every night since he returned. The admission hung in the air between them, and Rose saw something flicker in Ghost Horse's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of grief that matched his own. Little Star chose that moment to reach toward Ghost Horse, her small hands grasping at the air with the instinctive trust of a child who recognized family. "Uncle Ghost," she said clearly, and the words struck Ghost Horse like a physical blow, his rifle wavering as he stared at the niece he'd never had the chance to know. "She remembers me," he whispered, his voice breaking for the first time since entering the room. "But how can she remember when she was barely born when—" "I told her about you," Grey Eagle said quietly. "Every night when she was a baby, I told her stories about her uncle, who rode like the wind and could speak to horses in their own language." Ghost Horse's face crumpled, the war paint unable to hide the devastation beneath. Because he'd spent 3 years planning his revenge against a brother who had never stopped honoring his memory. "You destroyed everything I loved," Ghost Horse said. But the words lacked their earlier venom. "My wife, my son, my faith in the blood we shared." "I know," Grey Eagle replied, setting his rifle aside and standing defenseless before his brother's judgment. "I've lived with that knowledge every day since. It's why I couldn't look at Little Star without seeing the family I'd failed to protect." Rose held her breath as the two brothers faced each other across a chasm of pain that seemed impossible to bridge, while outside the sounds of battle continued to rage. But Little Star had no patience for adult anguish. She squirmed out of Rose's arms and toddled across the room to Ghost Horse, wrapping her small arms around his leg with the fearless love of innocence. "Uncle stay?" she asked, looking up at him with dark eyes that held Morning Star's gentleness and Grey Eagle's strength. Little Star missed Uncle. The simple request shattered something in Ghost Horse's carefully constructed armor of rage, and Rose watched tears carve clean tracks through his war paint as he knelt to embrace the niece he'd thought lost forever. "I can't stay, little one," he whispered against her hair. "I've done things that can't be undone, started a war that can't be stopped." As if his words had summoned it, the sound of approaching cavalry thundered across the frozen ground, reinforcements from Fort Robinson, arriving just as Ghost Horse's war party was beginning to lose momentum. "You have to go," Grey Eagle said urgently. "If the cavalry takes you alive, they'll hang you for leading this attack." Ghost Horse stood slowly, still holding Little Star, his eyes meeting his brother's for the first time without hatred. "Will you come with me?" he asked, and Rose's heart stopped because she understood that this was the moment when everything would be decided. Grey Eagle could choose his brother and the Lakota way of life, or stay with her and Little Star in the white world that had never fully accepted any of them. Grey Eagle looked at Rose, then at his daughter, then back at the brother who'd been lost to him for 3 years. "My family is here now," he said finally, his voice gaining strength as he spoke the truth he'd been afraid to acknowledge. "My place is with them," Ghost Horse nodded slowly, understanding passing between the brothers without words, and he kissed Little Star's forehead before setting her gently on the ground. "Take care of your papa," he told her solemnly, "and remember that you have an uncle who will always love you, even if he can't stay to watch you grow up." He turned to Rose, studying her face with the same intensity Grey Eagle sometimes showed, and she found herself holding her breath under his scrutiny. "You saved him," Ghost Horse said simply. "I came here to destroy my brother, but you've already rebuilt him into someone worth saving." Before Rose could respond, Ghost Horse was moving toward the broken door, pausing only to look back at Grey Eagle one final time. "The debt between us is paid," he said. "Live well, brother, and teach your daughter to be proud of all the blood that runs in her veins." Then he was gone, vanishing into the winter landscape as silently as he'd appeared, leaving behind only the echo of reconciliation and the promise of peace between brothers who'd found their way back to each other through the love of a child. Rose sank to her knees as the weight of everything they'd survived crashed over her. But Grey Eagle was there to catch her, his arms strong and sure as he pulled her close. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "All of it's finally over." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. And as the sounds of battle faded and little Star crawled into their embrace, Rose Catherine Webb allowed herself to believe that sometimes even the deepest wounds could heal, and the most broken families could find their way back to wholeness. The aftermath of Ghost Horse's raid brought investigators from Washington like vultures to carrion, their dark suits and suspicious eyes dissecting every detail of the attack, while Rose Catherine Webb found herself caught in a web of lies that threatened to destroy everything she'd fought to protect. Colonel Whitfield emerged from his hiding place in the ammunition bunker with renewed venom, his cowardice during the battle forgotten in favor of pointing fingers at easier targets, and his pale eyes fixed on Rose with the calculating malice of a man seeking scapegoats. "Nadel, curious thing," he said to Inspector Bradley Morrison, a thin man with wire spectacles who'd arrived on the morning train with a briefcase full of accusations. "How the savages knew exactly where to strike, almost as if someone had provided them with intelligence about our defenses." Rose felt her blood turn to ice as she realized the trap closing around her, because her knowledge of Dakota language and customs made her the perfect suspect for collaboration with the enemy. Grey Eagle stood beside her in the fort's main office, his face a mask of controlled fury, as he watched Whitfield weave his web of half-truths and implications. But Rose knew that his presence only made her look more guilty in the eyes of men who saw treachery in every shadow. "Miss Webb was observed treating the wounded attackers after the battle," Whitfield continued, his voice carrying the false concern of a man who'd found the perfect weapon, showing them the same care she'd shown our own people, almost as if she couldn't tell the difference between friend and foe. Inspector Morrison adjusted his spectacles and consulted his notes, his voice dry as autumn leaves when he spoke. "Indeed, and our preliminary investigation suggests that Miss Webb has extensive knowledge of native languages and customs, knowledge that could prove valuable to hostile forces." Rose opened her mouth to defend herself, but Grey Eagle's hand on her arm warned her to stay silent. His scout's instincts recognizing a situation where words could only make things worse. Little Star sat quietly in Rose's lap, her dark eyes moving between the adults with the solemn understanding of a child who'd learned that grown-ups could be cruel for reasons that made no sense. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, flipping through his papers with methodical precision, "we have reports that Miss Webb was heard speaking to the attackers in their own tongue during the battle, possibly giving them information about our casualties and defensive positions." The accusation was masterfully constructed, taking Rose's attempts to comfort wounded warriors and twisting them into evidence of espionage, and she felt despair settling over her like a shroud. "That's a lie," Grey Eagle said, his voice carrying the dangerous quiet of a man at the end of his patience. "Rose was trying to save lives, not betray anyone." Whitfield's smile was sharp as a blade. "Ah yes, Mr. Standing Bear, your relationship with Miss Webb is well documented, which raises interesting questions about your own loyalties during the attack." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and Rose saw Grey Eagle's hand drift toward his knife as the full scope of Whitfield's plan became clear: destroy them both by linking their supposed crimes. "I have witnesses," Morrison said, consulting another sheaf of papers, who state that Mr. Standing Bear made no attempt to defend the fort during the initial assault, almost as if he knew the attack was coming and chose not to warn anyone. Rose felt her world crumble as she realized that Grey Eagle's moment of shock upon recognizing his brother would be twisted into evidence of complicity, that his hesitation to fire on Ghost Horse's warriors would be painted as deliberate betrayal. "You're grasping at shadows," Grey Eagle said, but his voice lacked conviction because he knew how easily truth could be perverted by men with agendas. Mrs. Patterson chose that moment to enter the office, her weathered face set in lines of righteous indignation. followed by Mrs. Morrison and a half-dozen other fort wives whose children Rose had saved during the fever epidemic. "Inspector Morrison," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd spent 40 years managing frontier communities. "I trust you've been given accurate information about Miss Webb's actions during the attack." Morrison looked up from his papers with the irritation of a man interrupted in important work. "I have multiple witness statements regarding her suspicious behavior." "Then you should have mine as well," Mrs. Patterson replied, producing her own folded paper from her apron pocket, "along with statements from every woman in this room whose children are alive today because of Rose Webb's skill and courage." Rose felt tears blur her vision as she realized these women were risking their own standing in the community to defend her, that the gratitude she'd earned during the epidemic had created bonds stronger than fear. Mrs. Morrison stepped forward, her weathered hands clasped tightly in front of her. "My Tommy would be dead if not for Miss Webb, and I saw her during the attack. She was protecting our children, not helping the enemy." But Inspector Morrison merely adjusted his spectacles again, his expression unmoved by the women's testimony. "I appreciate your loyalty to Miss Webb, ladies, but emotion cannot override evidence of potential treason." Colonel Whitfield leaned back in his chair with obvious satisfaction, secure in his belief that official authority would triumph over community sentiment. But he'd underestimated the power of mothers protecting someone they considered family. "Evidence?" Mrs. Patterson repeated, her voice rising with indignation. "What evidence would that be exactly? That she knows Dakota healing songs? That she treated wounded men regardless of the color of their skin? That she chose mercy over vengeance?" Rose watched the confrontation with growing amazement, because these women were dissecting Morrison's case with the precision of trained lawyers, their frontier pragmatism cutting through official rhetoric like axes through deadwood. "The fact remains," Morrison said, his voice taking on a defensive edge, "that Miss Webb's background makes her a security risk, and recent events have only confirmed those concerns." Little Star had been listening to the adult conversation with growing distress, her small face scrunched with confusion and anger. But now she slipped from Rose's lap and marched across the room to stand directly in front of Inspector Morrison. "You mean to Mama Rose," she announced, her voice carrying all the moral authority of outraged innocence. "Mama Rose, good, you bad man." The simple declaration from a 3-year-old cut through the political maneuvering like a knife through silk, and Rose saw Morrison's composure crack as he realized how his accusations sounded when filtered through a child's understanding. "No." Grey Eagle moved to stand behind his daughter, his hands resting protectively on her small shoulders. "Little Star is right," he said, his voice gaining strength. "You're trying to destroy a good woman because it's easier than admitting your investigation is built on lies." Morrison's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension from the office doorway. "Inspector Morrison," said Captain James Dalton, the cavalry officer who'd led the reinforcements from Fort Robinson, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the events here." Rose felt her heart leap with hope, because Captain Dalton had a reputation for fairness and integrity that even Washington bureaucrats had to respect. "Captain," Morrison said, turning toward the newcomer with obvious relief, "I trust you have additional evidence regarding this matter." Dalton stepped into the room, his blue uniform crisp despite the hard ride from Fort Robinson, his weathered face grave as he surveyed the assembled group. "I do indeed," he said, producing his own set of documents from his jacket, including the confession of a captured warrior who confirms that this attack was planned for months without any assistance from fort personnel. Rose felt the weight of accusation begin to lift from her shoulders, but she knew better than to celebrate prematurely in a game where the rules could change without warning. "Furthermore," Dalton continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent 20 years fighting on the frontier, "I witnessed Miss Webb's actions during the battle personally, and I can state categorically that she showed remarkable courage in treating wounded soldiers while under enemy fire. Colonel Whitfield's confident expression began to crumble as he realized his carefully constructed case was falling apart. But he made one final desperate attempt to salvage his scheme. "Captain, surely you can see the security implications of allowing someone with Miss Webb's background to remain at such a sensitive posting." Dalton's laugh was sharp with contempt. "Colonel, the only security threat I see in this room is an officer who spent the entire attack hiding in a bunker, while better people fought to defend his command." The accusation struck Whitfield like a physical blow, his face going white as he realized his cowardice had been witnessed by someone whose testimony would carry weight with any military tribunal. Inspector Morrison looked between the two officers with growing uncertainty, his bureaucratic instincts warning him that he'd chosen the wrong side in a conflict he didn't fully understand. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should postpone any decisions about Miss Webb's status until a more thorough investigation can be conducted." But Mrs. Patterson had heard enough official equivocation to last several lifetimes, and her voice cut across Morrison's diplomatic retreat like a cavalry saber. "Inspector Rose Webb is a hero to this community, and if Washington thinks they can waltz in here and destroy her reputation based on the lies of a coward and the prejudices of a bureaucrat, they're going to learn what frontier justice really means." The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that Rose felt a chill run down her spine, because she understood that these women were prepared to go to war for her, that the bonds forged during the epidemic had created something stronger than official authority. Morrison seemed to sense the shift in the room's atmosphere, the way even his own authority paled, next to the collective will of women who'd learned to survive in a land that tested every assumption about civilization. "Of course," he said quickly, "we wouldn't want to act precipitously in such a sensitive matter." Little Star had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of a child learning important lessons about power and loyalty. But now she tugged on Grey Eagle's sleeve and whispered something that made his face go pale. "She says there's another bad man coming," Grey Eagle translated, his scout's instinct suddenly alert. "Someone who wants to hurt Mama Rose worse than these men do." Before anyone could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears, followed by voices that carried the unmistakable accent of educated Eastern authority. Rose felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized one of the voices, a cultured tone she'd hoped never to hear again, and she instinctively gathered Little Star closer as her past came riding through the fort's gates. "That's Judge Harrison Blackwood," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own thundering heartbeat. "He's the man who sent me west, who told me never to return to Minnesota or face charges for surviving the Dakota War." Grey Eagle's face went hard as granite as he understood that their enemies had called in reinforcements of their own, that the battle for Rose's freedom was about to escalate beyond anything they'd imagined possible. Outside, Judge Blackwood's voice boomed across the parade ground with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his words treated as divine commandments. "Inspector Morrison," he called, "I trust you have Miss Rose Catherine Webb in custody as per the warrant I sent ahead." The words fell into the office like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and dismay that reached every corner of the room. And Rose understood that her past had finally caught up with her in the form of a man who'd never forgotten her connection to the Dakota people he'd learned to hate. "What warrant?" Captain Dalton demanded. But Morrison was already reaching into his briefcase with the mechanical precision of a bureaucrat following orders. "Federal warrant for the arrest of Rose Catherine Webb," Morrison read, his voice growing stronger as he found himself back on familiar legal ground. on charges of collaboration with hostile forces during the Dakota War of 1862, accessory to the murder of federal agents, and inciting rebellion among subjugated populations. The charges were devastating in their scope and vagueness, designed to ensure conviction regardless of actual evidence. And Rose felt the walls closing in around her like the sides of a coffin. But as Judge Blackwood's footsteps approached the office door, Grey Eagle moved to stand between Rose and her accusers, his hand now openly resting on his knife handle. "Anyone who wants her," he said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of violence that had made him legendary among both cavalry officers and Lakota war chiefs. "Will have to go through me first." And as Rose Catherine Webb looked around the room at the faces of people who'd chosen to stand with her against overwhelming odds, she realized that sometimes the strongest fortresses weren't built of wood and stone, but of human hearts bound together by love and loyalty. Judge Harrison Blackwood entered the office like a plague wind made flesh, his black coat sweeping behind him and his silver-headed cane tapping against the wooden floor with the rhythm of a funeral march, while his pale eyes fixed on Rose Catherine Webb with the satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered his quarry. He was a tall man with the kind of distinguished bearing that commanded respect in civilized places, his white hair perfectly styled and his goatee trimmed to aristocratic precision. But Rose saw the cruelty that lurked beneath his cultured facade, like rot beneath polished wood. "Miss Rose Catherine Webb," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like a curse he'd been saving for years. Or should I say the Dakota Witch of Minnesota, finally found hiding among the savages where she belongs. Grey Eagle's hand tightened on his knife handle. But Rose placed a restraining touch on his arm, understanding that violence against a federal judge would only prove Blackwood's accusations and destroy any chance they had of fighting this legally. "Judge Blackwood," she said, rising from her chair with dignity intact, despite the chains she could feel closing around her. "I should have known you'd eventually find a way to finish what you started in Minnesota." Blackwood's smile was thin as winter ice. "What I started was justice for the families murdered by your Dakota friends. Justice that was denied when a certain missionary's daughter mysteriously vanished before she could face trial for her crimes." Little Star pressed closer to Rose, her young mind sensing the malevolence radiating from the black-coated man. And Rose instinctively shielded the child with her body, while her heart hammered against her ribs. "What crimes would those be exactly?" Captain Dalton asked, stepping forward with the authority of a man who'd spent 2 decades cutting through official lies. "Because federal warrants require specific charges, not general accusations." Blackwood's eyes glittered with triumph as he produced an ornate document from his coat, its wax seal and ribbons proclaiming its importance to anyone who might question his authority. "Conspiracy to aid and comfort enemy combatants during time of war," he read with theatrical precision. "Providing material support to hostile forces, inciting rebellion among pacified populations, and practicing heathen witchcraft in violation of territorial statutes." The charges were masterfully constructed to exploit every prejudice and fear that frontier communities harbored about women who consorted with Indians, and Rose felt despair settling over her like a shroud. But Mrs. Patterson had heard enough legal rhetoric to last several lifetimes, and her voice cut across Blackwood's pronouncement with the authority of a woman who'd buried 3 husbands and raised 2 generations of frontier children. "Judge Blackwood," she said, her tone deceptively mild, "I'm curious about something that's been troubling me since you arrived." Blackwood turned toward her with the condescending patience of a man addressing a child. "Yes, madam, what concerns you?" "Well," Mrs. Patterson continued, reaching into her apron pocket, "it's this letter I received last week from my sister in Minneapolis. Seems there's been quite a scandal involving a certain federal judge and missing funds from Dakota prisoner accounts." Rose watched Blackwood's composed expression crack slightly as Mrs. Patterson unfolded a newspaper clipping with the deliberate care of someone handling dynamite. "According to the Minneapolis Tribune," the older woman read aloud, Judge Harrison Blackwood is under investigation for embezzling over $50,000 in government funds intended for Dakota War reparations, money that mysteriously disappeared from accounts under his supervision. The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap, and Rose saw Inspector Morrison's face go pale as he realized he'd aligned himself with a potentially corrupt official. Blackwood's urbane mask slipped completely, revealing the desperate criminal beneath. That's a fabrication, a smear campaign by political enemies who want to discredit my work bringing justice to the frontier. But Captain Dalton was already studying the newspaper clipping with professional interest, his weathered face growing hard as he absorbed the implications. It says here that the investigation was prompted by testimony from Dakota survivors who claimed their promised payments never arrived, he said, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man who dedicated his life to military honor. The survivors who specifically mentioned Rose Webb as one of the few white people who tried to help them during the aftermath. Rose felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she realized that her supposed crimes were actually evidence of her innocence, that the same actions Blackwood had twisted into betrayal were being seen by others as heroism. Little Star had been watching this adult drama with the focused attention of a child, learning important lessons about truth and lies. But now she tugged on Grey Eagle's sleeve and whispered something that made his face go white. "She says the bad man hurt people like her mama," Grey Eagle translated, his voice rough with understanding. "Dakota people, children who looked like her." Blackwood's face contorted with rage as he realized his carefully constructed case was crumbling. But desperation made him dangerous rather than defeated. "This is irrelevant," he snarled, his cultured voice giving way to something uglier. "I have a federal warrant signed by territorial authority, and I'll see this half-breed loving witch hang if it's the last thing I do." The racial slur and threat of violence galvanized the room's occupants in ways that legal arguments never could. And Rose watched Grey Eagle's face transform into something that would have terrified war chiefs. "Judge," Grey Eagle said, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a predator selecting his target, "you just made a mistake that's going to cost you more than stolen money." But before violence could erupt, another voice cut through the tension from the office doorway, strong, clear, and carrying the unmistakable accent of educated authority. "I'm afraid Judge Blackwood's warrant has been superseded by more recent developments." Everyone turned to see a distinguished woman in her 50s enter the room. Her dark traveling dress mud-splattered from hard riding, but her bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to command. Rose's breath caught as she recognized features that belonged in daguerreotypes from her childhood. The same intelligent eyes, the same determined chin, the same aura of quiet strength that had made her father's sister legendary among Minnesota missionaries. "Aunt Margaret," Rose whispered, her voice breaking with disbelief and joy. "But how did you know where to find me?" Margaret Webb Thornton smiled with the satisfaction of a woman who'd spent 2 years tracking down her missing niece through careful investigation and stubborn determination. "My dear child," she said, crossing the room to embrace Rose with fierce protectiveness, "did you really think I'd stop looking for you just because certain corrupt officials wanted you to disappear?" Judge Blackwood's face had gone grey as ash, because Margaret Webb Thornton wasn't just Rose's aunt. She was the widow of Senator Charles Thornton, a woman with connections that reached to the highest levels of federal government. "Mrs. Thornton," Blackwood said, attempting to recover his composure, "this is a legal matter involving federal jurisdiction." Margaret's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Is it indeed? Because I have documents here that suggest your jurisdiction extends mainly to your own bank account." She produced a leather portfolio from her traveling bag, its contents rustling with the authority of official seals and congressional letterhead. "I have here," she continued, "a complete investigation into your financial irregularities conducted by the Treasury Department. along with testimony from Dakota survivors confirming that Rose Webb risked her life to provide aid and comfort to women and children during the 1862 conflict. Rose felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized that her aunt had spent 2 years fighting battles Rose didn't even know were being waged, clearing her name while she'd been hiding in shame. Furthermore, Margaret said, her voice gaining strength as she delivered the killing blow, I have a presidential pardon for any alleged crimes committed by Rose Catherine Webb during the Dakota War, signed by President Grant himself after reviewing evidence of her humanitarian efforts. The document she held up bore the Great Seal of the United States, its formal language declaring Rose's complete innocence and commending her courage in protecting civilian lives during wartime. Inspector Morrison looked between the competing authorities with the confusion of a bureaucrat whose carefully ordered world was collapsing into chaos. Mrs. Thornton, he said weakly, Judge Blackwood assured me that his evidence was conclusive. Judge Blackwood assured you of many things, Margaret replied coldly, most of which will be contradicted by the federal marshals who are currently searching his hotel room for additional evidence of embezzlement. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching boots announced the arrival of 2 men wearing deputy marshal badges, their grim faces leaving no doubt about their purpose. Judge Harrison Blackwood, the lead marshal said formally, you're under arrest for embezzlement of federal funds, fraud and abuse of judicial authority. Blackwood's mask of civilization finally cracked completely, revealing the snarling criminal beneath. This is a conspiracy, he raged, backing toward the window. I'll see you all destroyed for this. But his threats rang hollow as the marshals closed in, and Rose watched with amazement as the man who'd haunted her nightmares for 2 years was reduced to just another criminal caught in his own web of lies. After Blackwood was led away in chains, the office fell silent, except for the gentle sound of Little Star's breathing as she dozed in Rose's arms, exhausted by drama too complex for her young mind to fully process. Margaret approached her niece with eyes bright with unshed tears. Rose, my dear child, I'm so sorry it took me this long to find you. So sorry you had to endure years of exile for crimes you never committed. Rose looked up at her aunt through her own tears. How did you know to look for me here? I've been following reports of your work, Margaret said with obvious pride. A young woman using Dakota healing methods to save children from fever, teaching mixed-blood children to be proud of their heritage, protecting families that others had abandoned. She gestured around the room at the people who'd stood with Rose through the crisis. You've built something beautiful here, Rose. A family bound not by blood but by choice and love. Grey Eagle stepped forward, his face serious as he addressed Margaret with formal respect. Mrs. Thornton, your niece has given my daughter more than I ever could have alone. She's taught her to honor both sides of her heritage and find strength in the joining. Margaret studied Grey Eagle with the sharp intelligence that had made her late husband's political career possible, taking in his obvious devotion to Rose and the way Little Star reached for him with complete trust. And you, she said finally, what do you offer my niece in return? Grey Eagle's answer came without hesitation, his voice carrying the weight of promises made in darkness and tested by fire. Everything I am, everything I have, everything I'll ever be for as long as she'll have me. Rose felt her heart swell with emotion too powerful for words, as she realized that she was finally free, free from the past that had haunted her, free from the accusations that had driven her west, free to choose her own future with people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she'd survived. Little Star stirred in her arms, dark eyes opening to take in the transformed atmosphere, and she smiled with the radiant joy of a child who sensed that all the adult tensions had finally resolved into something safe and permanent. "Mama Rose stay now?" she asked, the question carrying all the hope and trust of innocence. Rose looked around the room at the faces of people who'd become her chosen family. Mrs. Patterson with her fierce protectiveness, the Fort wives who'd stood up to federal authority, Captain Dalton with his unwavering integrity, her Aunt Margaret who'd never stopped fighting for justice, and Grey Eagle, whose love had given her the courage to stop running from her past. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, her voice strong with certainty. "Mama Rose is staying right here where she belongs." 6 months later, the wedding took place in the fort's chapel. But it was really 3 ceremonies in one. Christian vows, spoken before a traveling preacher. Dakota promises exchanged under the open sky. And the simple joining of 2 people who'd found in each other what they'd thought lost forever. Rose wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved through years of exile and brought west by Aunt Margaret, while Grey Eagle stood tall in traditional Lakota regalia that honored his heritage and his bride's respect for both cultures. Little Star scattered wildflower petals with solemn concentration, a role as flower girl taken as seriously as any military duty. And the assembled guests included everyone from cavalry officers to reformed federal judges who'd learned that justice was more complex than law books could contain. As Grey Eagle slipped a ring made from Black Hill's gold onto Rose's finger, she thought about the journey that had brought them together. 2 broken people finding wholeness in each other. A child learning to bridge 2 worlds, and a community discovering that love could triumph over prejudice when good people chose to stand together. The ceremony ended with Little Star's clear voice raised in a Dakota blessing song, her words carrying across the prairie wind like prayers made audible. And Rose Catherine Webb, now Rose Standing Bear, knew that she'd finally found the home she'd been seeking since the day her old world burned. Later, as the celebration continued around them and Little Star fell asleep in her father's arms, Rose stood with her new husband looking out over the endless grassland that stretched toward tomorrow. "No regrets?" Grey Eagle asked quietly, and Rose turned to face him with eyes that held nothing but love and certainty. "Only one," she said, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers, "that it took us so long to find each other." And as the stars came out over Nebraska territory, painting the sky with the same light that had guided their ancestors for countless generations, the family that had chosen each other over all the forces trying to tear them apart settled into a peace that would last as long as hearts knew how to heal and love knew how to conquer. 5 years had passed since Rose Catherine Webb became Rose Standing Bear in a ceremony that united 3 cultures under an endless prairie sky. And now she stood in the doorway of the teaching hospital she'd built beside Fort Mitchell, watching her latest class of young women practice the healing arts she'd learned from Dakota grandmothers. The hospital had started as a single room where Rose treated everything from broken bones to difficult births. But word of her success had spread across the territory until territorial governors were sending their own physicians to learn from the woman who bridged ancient wisdom and modern medicine. Little Star, now 8 years old and tall for her age, moved through the hospital wards with the quiet confidence of someone who'd grown up surrounded by healing. Her small hands gentle as she helped Rose change bandages, and her voice soft as she sang comfort songs to patients in pain. "Mama Rose," she said, tugging on Rose's apron, "the lady in bed 7 is asking for the willow tea again, and she wants to know if you'll teach her daughter the song that makes fevers break." Rose smiled down at the child who'd become not just her daughter, but her apprentice. "Tell Mrs. Henderson that we'll make fresh willow tea this afternoon. And tomorrow, we'll start teaching young Mary the healing songs her grandmother should have passed down." The hospital's main ward buzzed with activity as Rose's student, nurses, young women from across the territory who'd come to learn what no medical school could teach them, practiced. Techniques that combined traditional European medicine with native healing wisdom. Sarah Patterson, the granddaughter of the fort's former housekeeper, carefully measured herbs under Rose's supervision while explaining their properties to a newer student. The white willow bark reduces fever and pain, but it must be combined with meadowsweet to protect the stomach. And the patient must drink plenty of water to prevent the kidneys from working too hard. Rose watched with pride as Sarah demonstrated the proper way to prepare the mixture, her movements confident but respectful, understanding that she was handling knowledge passed down through generations of native healers who trusted Rose enough to share their secrets. In the corner bed, Captain James Dalton was recovering from a bout of pneumonia that would have killed him without Rose's intervention, his weathered face peaceful in sleep, while his wife Mary knitted beside him, occasionally humming one of the Dakota healing songs Rose had taught her. He's breathing easier today, Mary Dalton said, as Rose checked her husband's pulse. Whatever magic you worked with those steam treatments and herb poultices, it's given us back 20 years we thought we'd lost. Rose pressed her fingers to the captain's wrist, feeling the steady rhythm that spoke of lungs clearing and strength returning. Not magic, Mary, just knowledge that your people and mine have been sharing for longer than anyone remembers. It's only seemed magical because so few have been willing to listen. The afternoon brought its usual parade of patients, cavalry wives seeking remedies for morning sickness, frontier children with broken bones that needed setting, and old soldiers whose war wounds ached with changing weather. But today also brought an unexpected visitor who made Rose's heart race with memories. Ghost Horse stood in the hospital doorway, no longer painted for war, but dressed in the clothing of a successful rancher, his dark eyes taking in the bustling ward with obvious amazement. "Brother," he said to Grey Eagle, who'd just arrived with supplies from town, "I heard stories about what your wife had built, but I didn't believe them until I saw it with my own eyes." Grey Eagle embraced his twin with the fierce joy of siblings who'd found their way back to each other, despite years of separation. "She's transformed this whole territory, saved more lives than either of us did in all our years of fighting." Rose approached the two brothers with little Star at her side, still hardly believing that Ghost Horse had walked openly into a cavalry fort. But his presence here spoke to how much the world had changed in 5 short years. "Ghost Horse," she said, extending her hand in greeting, "I'd heard you'd settled down near the Black Hills, started raising cattle and horses." He took her hand with surprising gentleness, his face serious as he studied the woman who'd helped heal the rift between brothers. "I came to thank you," Rose standing bare, "for giving my brother back his soul, and to ask if you would consider teaching my wife some of your healing skills." The request surprised Rose, because Ghost Horse had married a full-blood Lakota woman named Singing Bird, who was renowned among her people for traditional healing knowledge. "Your wife already knows more about Dakota medicine than I ever will," Rose said carefully. "What could I possibly teach her that her own grandmothers haven't already shared?" Ghost Horse's smile was sad but proud. "She knows our old ways perfectly, but our children will live in a world where both kinds of healing are needed, where a doctor's certificate might matter as much as a grandmother's blessing." Rose understood immediately what he was asking, not to replace traditional knowledge, but to supplement it, to give his wife the tools she'd need to practice openly in a world increasingly dominated by white medical establishments. "Bring her here," Rose said without hesitation. "We'll learn from each other, and together we'll train healers who can serve both our peoples without having to choose between them." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Aunt Margaret, now a permanent resident of the territory who'd established a school for mixed-blood children, her arms full of books and her face bright with excitement. "Rose, dear, you'll never guess what news I've received from Washington," she said, setting down her burden to embrace her niece. "The Territorial Medical Board wants to grant you an official physician's license based on your practical experience and success rate." The announcement sent ripples of excitement through the hospital ward, because official recognition would legitimize Rose's methods and protect her from any future attempts at persecution. But Rose felt a flicker of uncertainty. because accepting a white medical license might seem like a rejection of the native teachers who'd shared their knowledge with her. Little Star sensed her hesitation and tugged on her hand. "Mama Rose, if you have the white paper, can you teach more people how to help sick children?" The simple question cut through Rose's doubts like sunlight through clouds, because she realized that recognition from the medical establishment wouldn't diminish her. Respect for traditional healing, it would give her a platform to bridge the gap between different ways of understanding health and wellness. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, kneeling to meet Little Star's eyes. "With that white paper, we can teach doctors in big cities about the medicines your Dakota ancestors discovered, and we can make sure no one ever has to choose between different kinds of healing again." That evening, the extended Standing Bear family gathered for dinner in the cabin. Gray Eagle had expanded over the years to accommodate their growing household, the table groaning under the weight of dishes that reflected their blended heritage. Roast venison alongside cornbread, wild berry preserves next to pickled vegetables, and Rose's famous healing tea made from herbs that grew in 3 different climates. Gray Eagle stood at the head of the table, his hair now touched with silver, but his eyes still bright with the love that had sustained them through every challenge. "5 years ago I came home expecting to find my daughter, but instead I found a family I never dared to dream was possible." He raised his cup of sassafras tea in a toast to Rose, who taught us all that healing isn't just about mending bodies, it's about mending hearts, communities, and the bonds between people who were meant to find each other. Rose felt tears blur her vision as she looked around the table at faces that had become the center of her world. Little Star, growing into a young woman who would carry both cultures forward with pride. Ghost Horse and his family representing the healing of old wounds, and Margaret, whose love had never wavered despite years of separation, and Gray Eagle, whose patient devotion had given her the courage to stop running from her destiny. "I used to think," Rose said, her voice strong despite the emotion in her throat, "that I was cursed to live between 2 worlds without belonging fully to either. But now I understand that some people are meant to be bridges, to show others that different doesn't have to mean divided." Little Star stood up from her chair with the solemnity of someone making an important announcement. "Mama Rose, I want to learn everything you can teach me about healing, so when I'm grown up I can help people the same way you do." Rose's heart swelled with pride and purpose as she realized that the knowledge she'd gathered from so many sources would live on through the daughter she'd chosen, and who'd chosen her in return. "Then we'll start your formal training tomorrow," she said. "You'll learn from me, from your uncle Ghost Horse's wife, from the army doctors who come to study our methods, and from every patient who trusts us with their pain." As the evening wore on, and the conversation flowed around the table like a river connecting different landscapes, Rose stepped outside to breathe the cool night air and marvel at the distance she'd traveled from that desperate young woman who'd fled Minnesota with nothing but guilt and fear. Gray Eagle joined her on the porch, slipping his arm around her waist with the easy intimacy of long partnership. "Any regrets about the path that brought you here?" Rose leaned against his solid warmth and looked up at stars that had witnessed centuries of human struggle and triumph. "Only that I spent so many years believing I had to carry my burdens alone, when the whole time there were people waiting to help share the load." In the distance, a coyote's howl echoed across the prairie, answered by another from the opposite direction, and Rose smiled as she recognized the sound of creatures who understood that survival was easier when you had a pack to run with. "What are you thinking about?" Gray Eagle asked, and Rose turned to face the man who'd given her not just love, but the courage to embrace her own strength. "I'm thinking about a story I want to tell Little Star," she said, "about a young woman who thought she was running away from her destiny, but was actually running toward the life she was meant to live." Gray Eagle's laugh was warm as summer rain. "Will it be a true story?" Rose stood on her tiptoes to kiss the man who'd helped her write that story, with their shared choices and mutual devotion. "The truest story I know. about a servant who discovered she was meant to be a healer, a scout who learned to be a father, and a little girl who taught them both that love is stronger than any force that tries to divide us. Inside the house, little Star's voice could be heard teaching Ghost Horse's youngest son the English words to a Dakota lullaby, the melody floating through the open windows like a promise that the future would be built on foundations of understanding rather than fear. As Rose and Grey Eagle returned to the warmth and light of their home, where 3 generations of chosen family continued to weave the bonds that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The prairie wind carried their laughter across miles of grassland where other families were discovering their own ways to build bridges between different worlds. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the lamplight, the spirit of Morning Star smiled down at the daughter she'd never lived to raise, knowing that little Star had found in Rose Catherine Webb Standing Bear not just a mother, but a guide who would teach her that being caught between 2 cultures wasn't a burden to bear, but a gift to share with a world that desperately needed healing. The story that had begun with a broken scout, finding a servant singing to his abandoned daughter, had grown into something larger than any of them could have imagined, a testament to the power of love to transform not just individuals but entire communities, and proof that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that bring us home to people we were always meant to find. In years to come, the Standing Bear Hospital would train hundreds of healers who carried Rose's integrated approach across the expanding frontier, while Little Star would become Dr. Catherine Standing Bear Morrison, the first woman to serve as Territorial Health Commissioner, her policies ensuring that traditional native healing knowledge would be preserved and respected alongside modern medical advances. But those achievements lay in a future none of them could see, and for now it was enough to sit together in the lamplight, sharing stories and songs that bound their hearts together more surely than any law or custom ever could, secure in the knowledge that they had found in each other something rare and precious, a love strong enough to heal the deepest wounds and brave enough to build new traditions from the best parts of old ones. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.